News Watch with a special news update. As a result of a meeting with government national security advisors, the President has declared that truth is a threat to national security, and anyone speaking truth will be prosecuted, and it will be considered a federal offense.
And the truth is in the streets. As we struggle for change, the questions always occur. How many times this or how many times that? Bringing in truth, not to offend, but the answer is when we are ready to bring it to an end. The White House remains white, justice remains out of sight, and the mothers in the hood ask the question. I said the White House remains white, justice remains out of sight, and the mothers in the hood ask the question. How many times living in uncertain glory? How many times will we continue to tell this story? How many times will it take for us to understand? How many times we must develop a master plan?
Dr. Jeffries, we're here in Ghana, and you're leading a tour on an African pilgrimage as you have done several times in the past. However, this particular pilgrimage, we're here to participate in the second annual Emancipation Day and also the Manifest activities. Could you please tell us, give us a brief history of Emancipation Day and its relevancy to the Pan-African experience?
Certainly, I will be glad to. As you did mention, we were able to get a group of our people from the States to join us in the celebration of the second annual Emancipation Day, which was instituted last year by the President of Ghana after he visited the Caribbean and saw the emancipation activities in Jamaica and in Trinidad. And he felt that coming out of the British tradition at the end of slavery should be instituted in Ghana. So he put it in the hands of his deputy minister in the Ministry of Tourism, the Honorable Minister Mofa. And he was able to plan, along with others, including myself and Brother Smalls, an enormous celebration, which went way beyond anybody's expectation. Particularly since during that Emancipation celebration of a week, they were able to bring the remains of a former runaway slave in America that escaped to the north and was able to fight in the Mexican-American War. And so he died an honorable veteran of the U.S. Army, but he was buried in the Naval Yard at Brooklyn. So they were able to bring his remains to Ghana alongside the remains of a woman who passed on in Jamaica. So you had this unusual circumstances of two bodies being brought back to Ghana. Symbolically, it was enormous and very powerful. So they had the bodies received at the airport with solemn rites early in the morning. We were there, and then they took them through the streets of Accra to sit in state at the Du Bois Center in the Marcus Garvey Guest House at the Du Bois Center, and we were able to say a few remarks there. And then they took the remains through the streets of Accra to the International Conference Center, where they had a major conference on reparations, enslavement, repatriation, emancipation. And the President of the nation and most of the ministers and other representatives from African nations were there. And it was very prominent, very meaningful. And then they were able to take those remains through the streets of Accra to the Kwame Nkrumah Memorial Park, where they remained for the evening for a wake, a midnight wake. And once the wake took place, we had a chance to speak. And it was very moving because it was in front of the Nkrumah statue with his left foot forward, pointing his finger to Africa in reference to uniting. And so at midnight, when they had the wake ceremony, and thousands of people were there, the remains were taken along the coast to Cape Coast area, and we followed them and met villages along the road. Thousands of people came out, and before the sun came up, we were on the shores waiting to have the boats pick up the coffins and take them to Cape Coast Castle Dungeon, which they did, and it was extraordinary. And then we got on buses and met the boats as they came into Cape Coast Castle, and then they had a welcome home in the Cape Coast Dungeon. They came back through the door of no return. Previously, people said everybody who went out never returned, but here are two people who came back. So symbolically, the door of no return is now the door of return. And so in the courtyard of Cape Coast Castle Dungeon, they had this enormous activity. And then finally, they took the remains 30, 40 kilometers on the road to Kumasi to Asin Menso, where they had a formal funeral, Durbar, where all the chiefs and people came out, thousands of people. Nana Sarpong officiated. He's the chief that installed many of us, Marcus Garvey, Gary Bird, myself, Brother Small, my wife, and a whole host of others, Dr. Pat Newton. So he officiated at this formal funeral ceremony, and then they took the remains across the road where they had a burial site. So that was extraordinary. Nothing like that has ever happened before. Europeans were upset. People were saying, why are you bringing back bones? Why are you worried about the past? And everybody else worries about the past, but they don't want Africans to worry about the past. And they don't want us to see us as people with a common ancestry and a common struggle. But clearly, that's what Emancipation was. And hopefully they'll do it every year. Hopefully it'll expand. This year they had the second annual. It wasn't as expansive because it was dovetailed with Panifest. Panifest is the Pan-African Theater Arts Festival. And because of the prominence of Panifest, Emancipation was placed alongside it and overlapped it. And in order for Emancipation not to be a competition with Panifest, it was scaled down. And Panifest, which happens every 2 years, was given the first place berth. Panifest includes a colloquium at the University of Cape Coast, which is significant because people are meaningfully looking at African culture, African history, African development, African future, African women, and the family. And then they have these cultural activities in different venues. Cape Coast Castle Dungeon Courtyard, Elmina Castle Dungeon Courtyard, or the Cultural Center along the Cape Coast Elmina Road. And so those activities have been well organized. Attendance could improve. A lot of young people there, not as many people from the diaspora as I thought would be there. And various groups kind of come from Suriname, Curacao, Jamaica, Trinidad, formal groups, Nigeria, Ivory Coast, to present. So the concept was developed by a black woman, F.R. Sutherland, who was into theater arts, helped develop Ghana's theater art program at the university. And she came up with the idea of the Pan-African Cultural Festival. And it can work. It can be a prominent thing because it occurs in July, August, when a lot of people are on vacation and can come to Ghana.
Now, we are in the second year of Emancipation Day observance and celebrations. How long has Panifest been?
This is the third or fourth Panifest.
And that being every 2 years, we're talking about approximately 8 years ago it began.
Yeah, in 82 or 3 it began. 92 or 3, I believe, and then there was 194 and 197, and now there's one now.
Now, one of the most significant aspects of the pilgrimages that you lead to Ghana, West Africa, are the perspective that you give when we entered into the slave dungeons where our ancestors were held before they were taken to the North America, before they were placed on what you refer to as the floating concentration camps,
right,
and taken to North America to be
and the Caribbean and South America.
Okay, let me not be guilty of not including all who were guilty and participants in that criminal activity. But many times when you're telling the story, you talk a lot about the untold story, the elements of participation in our enslavement, in our degradation, in our ma'afa, that others don't seem to want to approach. Can you talk about that? What you have referred to as the untold story, or the story that needs to be told?
And I also refer to it as the truth.
Okay.
Okay, and so that's basically what it is. The story or the truth of what enslavement was has only been told in bits and pieces and from different perspectives. My approach is to look at it in what I refer to as a systems analysis, and you can't understand it, meaning the phenomena of enslavement, the transatlantic enslavement system, unless you see it through its system dimension. Looking at it by the bits and pieces would achieve what an African parable refers to as a partial truth, where 4 or 5 blind men came upon an elephant, and in their description, one had the leg and it saw it as like a tree trunk, and one had the trunk of the elephant and saw it like a snake, and one had the tail, and so one had the ear. So they all had aspect of the truth, but they didn't have the systems component to pull all the pieces together and make full sense. So the same thing with enslavement. Most of us say slavery starts in an African village. Well, it did not. And most of us say that slavery, a major factor in the slave trade, were Africans, and that wasn't the case. Slavery is a European conceived, maintained, sustained phenomena. And so unless people understand that, they don't understand what enslavement is all about. We're not talking about domination of one people by another. That has always occurred. We're not talking about so-called African traditional enslavement. You're talking about a process in which a group of people dominated another and attempted to pull them out of the human family. And that's how we really have to describe enslavement. It's an enormous crime against humanity. But it doesn't start in a village in Africa. It doesn't start with slave routes coming down to the shores of Africa. Because Africans would come down from the villages if they could and stand on the shore. They'd still be standing there and there wouldn't be any slave system. Slave system was conceived in Europe. Europeans, having enslaved their own people for 1,000 years in the white slave trade, were into a slave mode when they came across the Africans. So unless you can see 1,000 years of the white slave trade, you can't even understand what happened here. And so with the fall of the Roman Empire, 400, 450 AD, European systems collapsed in terms of trade and economics, and the biggest thing they had going between East and West, between Europe and Western Asia, was slavery. But it wasn't Africans, it was white people. Western Europeans selling Eastern Europeans, the Slavic peoples, into slavery. So, and that's the term, slavery actually comes from Slavs. It doesn't come from Africans. But we have this tendency of saying African slaves. No, it's enslaved African peoples, but not African slaves. We want to apply the term generically to someone, apply it to the Slavic peoples. But most of us don't have any knowledge of the white slave trade. But that has to be clocked in. And then the period of feudalism, where European systems collapsed, where Europe was land poor, resource poor, people poor, unable to maintain its basic systems of functioning. That so-called Dark Ages. That has to be put in the picture. And then 500 years of struggle against Islam. So all of this is occurring before the transatlantic slave trade. And then the war with Islam also included the Crusades. So you have from the 10th century on to the 15th century these insane crusades in which all Europe is geared toward this marching across Europe to save Jerusalem, which was an insanity. And while the European men got on their horses to save Jerusalem, they locked their women up in chastity belts. So that's an interesting aspect of Europeanness. But the most interesting aspect of Europeans in relationship to their women, and this needs to be told, is that millions of European women were killed during this period because they were considered evil and witches. And so unless you clock that in, you can't even understand what motivated the European to even get out of Europe to do the things he did. And so I don't start with Africans coming out of a village, whether Africans pulled them out or not and dragged them down to the shores. You can't even understand why they were on the shore unless you understand that Europeans had come out of Europe, traveled down the coast of Africa, came to establishing so-called trade, but they really were interested in slavery from the very beginning because they had been at war with the Moors. The Moorish people had dominated Europe from 711 AD to 1492. You had a domination of Spain and Portugal and southern Italy by Moorish peoples who were people of color. So there was this war going on before West Africa became involved in the struggle. So I start the system in Europe, Spain and Portugal. And you got to put the Pope in there because several popes gave Spain and Portugal the right to enslave the infidels, which were non-Catholic peoples that they were at war with. So unless you see the papal bulls, which are the papal decrees, establishing, giving Spain and Portugal the right to enslave, you can't even understand how the Catholic Church was in the middle of all of this.
Now, when we visit the slave dungeons, they have a lot of texts that go along with the displays that explain a lot of this. However, they have left a lot of it out. Can you go into that that dynamic? How is it that you can have a monument to a historical episode or a historical drama with major portions that will give a clearer picture to what happened being left out, and the need and importance for us filling in those?
Well, Dr. John Henry Clark aptly explained that when the Europeans colonized our lands and our resources and our bodies, he colonized knowledge. And it's necessary for him to whitewash the history of the world, and certainly to whitewash the history of enslavement. And Africans here who want to curry favor with the Europeans and get whatever resources and crumbs the Europeans can throw their way have joined them in the whitewash. And so that's been one of our big complaints. As they take the slave forts and dungeons and make them World Heritage Monuments, they're whitewashing what actually occurred there. They're talking about trade. They don't want to say even slave trade. They want to talk about trade. And they want to talk about the positiveness that came out, not talk about the devastation, as our sister Marimba Ani, one of our great minds, formerly called Donna Richards, has produced a book called Yurugu. And this particular volume is very important because it talks about the African-centered critique of European cultural thought and behavior. And so enslavement is an important part of understanding European cultural thought and behavior. And as I was saying before, if you don't understand what they did to their own people and their own women, then you can't understand why they did what they did to the Native Americans and Africans. Because there's a process in their culture which has produced central characteristics which I have described as the 3 Ds: domination, destruction, and death. Okay? And we need to understand that. The European Jewish community needs to understand that more than anybody else, because what happened to them in World War II was domination, destruction, and death. But they weren't the only people so treated. The European history is full of domination, destruction, and death. And so our enslavement represents a continuation of that process. And the European does not want to admit what he has done. So he has turned history upside down. So we have Christopher Columbus discovering America. How can you discover America when there were millions of people there in high cultures and civilizations from one end of the North America through Central America, down through the high Indies into South America? Cities larger than any cities in America, any cities in Europe. Pyramids and high cultures, floating gardens, writing system. So how can he have discovered people who are already there? But we still say Columbus discovered America. And he never even got to America. He was on the out islands of the Caribbean. But still that myth is perpetuated, parades and events occur, in October, and at the 50th anniversary of the so-called discovery, even the Pope was going to come to America, until some people said, we questioned the Pope and the Pope's involvement in slavery. So the Pope kind of chilled out on having this big 500-year celebration around Columbus. But that's the European way. So the people involved in enslavement have been many, many European nations. Spain and Portugal, the Catholic nations, started it. By the 15 and 1600s, the Protestant nations emerged with the Protestant Reformation, and so there was an attempt by Protestant nations to take the slave system from Spain and Portugal, and those Protestant nations included the Dutch, the English, the Danes, the Swedes, and some German peoples. And so you have to see a war between the Protestants and the Catholics. They called it the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. You're talking about wars going on for years. Because we don't have an analysis of European history, we can't even see how it relates to African history. But it's out of this war and devastation, these 3Ds, domination, destruction, and death, comes the triangular slave system, which linked Europe with Africa with the so-called New World. And what happened was one of the most devastating epochs in the history of man in terms of death and destruction. And so the European wants that to be covered up. So we don't think of the Native Americans as having been destroyed. But if there were tens of millions of them, and after only a few years, millions, tens of millions had been killed, it's one of the greatest holocausts in the history of the world. That's never even mentioned. The peoples of the Caribbean islands were Native Americans. They're gone. Many peoples in Central America were wiped out, not only by European death and destruction, but by European disease. Disease mind, disease body, disease spirit, wiping out millions of people.
Whole groups.
Yes, and so we need to clock that into the historical picture. And Columbus needs to be given his proper kudos. Columbus was the leading drum major for slavery. He started the transatlantic slave trade. And when he couldn't bring enough gold back to Spain and Portugal, to his mentors who were the Sephardic Jews who had converted to Catholicism, who ran the money system and statecraft around the Spanish throne, when he couldn't bring back enough gold, as he promised Queen Isabella so she could continue the Crusades, he brought hundreds of Native Americans across the Atlantic as enslaved persons. So if you want to give Columbus his proper due, let's make him the leading drum major for slavery and the initiator for transatlantic enslavement. But we don't do that. We have parades for Columbus Day, and that history is not revealed. But our role as historians and people involved in African history is to reveal the history. But people don't want us to do it. Not all the Europeans covering it up. And one of the key European groups covering it up have been the European Jewish folks, because they say their hands are clean. And when I look at their hands, it's dripping with blood.
Okay.
And so they say we were involved in civil rights, but I said before the civil rights movement of the 60s, where were you?
In the 1860s.
And let's go back a few hundred years and put you in the middle of enslavement. And they say we were not there. I say, well, your records tell us that we're there. I have 50 or 60 books on enslavement, and 35 of them are written by Jewish scholars on the Jewish involvement in slavery. So if you don't want us to know about your involvement, then you have to tell your people to stop writing the books and burn those they already have. As long as those books are there, we're going to study it. As long as it involves our history, we're going to reveal it. So the big attack on me for the last 10 years has been because I mentioned that some Jews, rich Jews, were involved in enslavement. Well, that's a no-no. Nobody's supposed to say that, but it's the truth.
It's okay for them to write it, but it's not okay for you to mention it.
And to analyze it in terms of your history and your struggles and what's happened to your people. But that's also true of people like the Dutch. They don't raise as much vocal hell as the Jewish people, but the Dutch were the leading slavers.
Would the Dutch be the same people that we find in Azania, or as some people know, are referred to as South Africa?
Yes, and because of their enslavement system, that's how they found themselves in Azania, South Africa, because in 1652, as they were trying to rip off the slave system from the Portuguese, along with the British, and they had several wars with the British, they had to leave. They were trying to find trade or enslavement in the Pacific and Indian Ocean as well as in the Atlantic. So stopping in what is now called Cape Town area was a fueling stop for the ships on their way to the Indian Ocean. So we need to tie in the Dutch involvement in Asia along with the Dutch involvement in the Atlantic. And then you need to put the Jewish community in with the Dutch to see partners in the crime against humanity. And it was mainly rich Jews, because the Dutch had no need for poor Jews. They said, bring your rich Jews to Amsterdam and join us in our attempt to take the slave system from the Catholics. So they did that. They attempted in 1595 to take Brazil, to take Elmina here along the coast of Ghana. They were unsuccessful. They kept trying. But by 1630 they took Brazil, Pernambuco and Recife. By 1637 they came to the west coast of Africa. They took Elmina from the Portuguese, and then they went down the coast and took Dahomey and Angola, and in that period of time they also got Gorée. So they controlled the slave system from which people were pulled out of Africa to go into the enslavement in the New World. And in the 1640s also, they went to war with Portugal, but it was an interesting struggle because Portugal broke from England, broke from Spain, and established an independent monarchy. They had a joint monarchy. And Portugal had no money to fight Spain, which was the richest nation in the world. So in order for Portugal to get arms to fight Spain, they had to go to the Jewish community and the Dutch community and ask them for help to fight Spain. And they did. In Europe, they were partners fighting Spain. But then since the Dutch and the Jewish community wanted the Portuguese slaving empire, they were at war with the same Portuguese over the colonies outside of Europe. So they had this dichotomy and this interesting conflict of being allies in Europe against Spain, but fighting each other in the Caribbean, in Brazil, and in Africa. So I'm saying if we don't understand all of these things going on, the Counter-Reformation, the conflict between the Catholics and the Protestants, which was heavily involved in what we call the 30 Years' War, 1612 to 1648. There's a 30 Years' War in Europe, thereabout. And that's the Catholics and the Protestants fighting. And if we don't clock that in, we don't see how Europe was in a devastating period where the Jews were leaving Eastern European nations as refugees and coming into Amsterdam. So Amsterdam by the 1650s was overloaded with refugees. So when the Portuguese finally regained Brazil in 1654, fleets of ships left, and at one point 16 ships left with the Jews of Brazil who had been slaving, and they brought them to Amsterdam. 14 ships came to Amsterdam, 2 ships went to the Caribbean. And when the 14 ships with a couple thousand Jews came into Amsterdam, on top of the thousands of Jews that had come from the 30 Years' War, that was an overload of the Amsterdam Jewish community. So in response to that, they fed the people who came from Brazil with a kosher meal, gave them a bath and another set of clothing, and then sent them out to establish colonies of sugar and slaves in the Caribbean. So I have what I'm developing called the 13 colonies. And most of us, because of our limited knowledge, think of the 13 colonies in North America. I'm not talking about that. At the same time that the North American U.S. colonies were being developed, the 13 colonies, there were 13 Jewish colonies being developed in the Caribbean and South America. So that history needs to be tied together. And part of the tying together is what we saw in Fort Amsterdam, where we just left a few moments ago. And unfortunately, not everybody was there to film it. But that Fort Amsterdam, which was the first British enslavement center along the coast of Africa from 1631 to 1665. But when the Second Anglo-Dutch War, when the Dutch and the English started fighting each other, and the war was settled, the Dutch gave up New Amsterdam, and it became New York. And the British said you can have Suriname, and it became the leading Dutch slaving colony. But at the same time, Fort Amsterdam in 1665 moved from English hands to Dutch hands. So the Dutch now had another base on the African coast. They had Fort Amsterdam linked to not New Amsterdam, because that's now English, but Suriname, which is the New Netherlands. So you have to see a triangle link between Amsterdam in Europe, Fort Amsterdam on the west coast of Africa, and New Holland, New Netherlands in South America, Suriname. Then when you see that triangle, you can understand what the system was all about. But if you don't see the triangle, and you're talking about African villages or Africans enslaving Africans, then you don't see the slave system that we know that perpetuated itself for 400 years, with Europeans making profits, fitting out the ships in Europe, leaving the ports of Europe, first the Spanish and Portuguese ports of Seville and Oporto and Lisbon, coming to Africa, then from the French ports of Nantes, Bordeaux, and Marseille, and Rochelle, going to Africa, and then coming from the Dutch ports of Amsterdam and Rotterdam, Zeeland and The Hague, then coming from the German ports of Hamburg and Copenhagen's Danish ports, then coming from the English ports of London, Liverpool, and Bristol. All of that, fitting out of ships, making a profit, with poor manufactured goods on the ships, going to the coast of Africa, trading these poor goods for gold and Africans, and then taking the captive Africans to the New World, and then working them to death on the plantations, then making a profit, then taking the profit from the slave activity back to Europe, making another profit. So this four-way profit system is what was the motor that moved enslavement, not Africans selling Africans or Africans bringing Africans down to the coast. European is at the center of it. The Pope blessed it all. Every ship that left was blessed by either a Catholic priest or a Protestant minister. So they claimed they were doing the work of God. So there's something devilish about that. There's something devilish about even the concept that you're going to destroy somebody's humanity and you're doing the work of God. But see, they had read black people out of the human family. And so they could justify it in their minds and in their biblical traditions that we were not worthy of being treated better than the mules and the ox and the horse and whatever in enslavement. So that's why I say we need to see the slave system and not just slavery. And even when we see slavery, we need to see it as its European roots established it, and not as we perceive it. See, Europeans have said, we're slaves. They say slaves out of Africa. They don't say captives out of Africa. When people were taken from their village and brought down here, they weren't slaves. They were captives. That's why they had them in chains. There's no plantations for them to work here. When they were sold into enslavement in the so-called New World, then that's when the serious enslavement process takes place that we know of. But that story hasn't been told, and the big lie is continuing being told. There's so many books coming out now that we've raised the question of enslavement that I laugh when they come out. One came out called The Slave Trade by someone called Hugh Thomas. It's this thick, and it deals with a serious analysis of slavery. And he starts out in it by saying that Minister Farrakhan and others had said that Jews were involved in slavery, but he was only able to find 2 Jews involved in slavery. True. And I saw him on TV saying that Jeffries and Farrakhan had said something, and he could only find 2 Jews involved in slavery. Now what they do is they say the Anglo-Saxon slave system. But there's no Anglo-Saxon slave system. It was a European international slave system. So if you're going to just chop off a piece of it, call it the Anglo-Saxon slave system, and not find any Jews in there, then that's your attempt to distort the perspective. England didn't allow Jews in England. So if there are not many Jews involved in the Anglo-Saxon slave system, because they were anti-Semitic, and they prevented the Jews from coming in England. They chased the Jews out of England in 1290 AD, and they didn't let them back in until 1655, when the letter was written from Amsterdam by Rabbi Menashe ben Israel to allow the Jews back into England. By then the slave system is already expansive and growing, and the Jews are not in England because they've been kept out. So if you want to understand the Jewish involvement in enslavement, you got to go across the English Channel to Amsterdam, to Holland, and then you'll see the heavy involvement in enslavement. And these people know that. So for them to focus on the Anglo-Saxon end of the deal means that they're hiding the truth. Now there's a new book that came out called Jews, Slaves, and the Slave Trade by someone called Farber, F-A-B-E-R. And it's called The Definitive Answer, Straightening Out the Record. And the record that needs to be straightened out because some professors, like a professor at City College, who was the head of African Studies, said some Jews were involved in slave trade. Now this is a professor from the university system that I was a part of that can't even mention my name. There's no professor at City College, it's me, okay, and everybody knows who it is. And he never contacted me to say, well, Dr. Jeffries, I know you have this claim to fame that you said Jews were involved in slavery, and could you clarify that or give me the source of your information? He never contacted me. I never met the man. But then when I read his book, the first few pages, he mentions that there was a significant involvement of Jewish peoples in the Dutch slave trade, and then he quickly passes over that and goes into the English slave trade and leaves the Dutch slave trade alone. And instead of saying that our initial work should be on the English slaving, but if we really wanted a comparison, let's compare Jewish involvement with the Dutch compared to Jewish involvement with the English. That's a scientist and a scholar would have done that. But you can't do that because their involvement with the Dutch is so enmeshed that the real deal is told. And so you just hide it. But it's going to emerge. My whole approach is truth crushed to earth will rise again stronger than before. And so as the truth emerges, it's going to be more difficult to hide it.
You know, from our exposure to history, it would seem that a lot of the wars, skirmishes that were engaged in by European nations against one another had at its roots and foundation Africans, or the trade or the attempt to take over the trade in African people. And that relationship or connection is not a relationship that is exposed when one goes through the academies or the school or the schooling. I know I was never exposed to it, and I don't know if anyone here was exposed to it in that manner. But we find when we pull back the veil that much of the activity of Europeans against one another had Africans, or the attempt to control the trade in Africans, at its roots.
Well, part of what you said is correct and part is not correct. The European history that I learned, and I have what I call a $1 million white boy education.
Right.
The best that they give their own I got. Okay. From the grammar school, all these little white kids where I was the president of them, to the junior high school where I was the president, to the high school where I was the president, to Lafayette College where there were only 2 black people, and when I joined there with another black fellow, we doubled the black population from 2 to 4, 100%. So in 1955 we integrated Lafayette College. And then when I went to Europe, 59, 60, to study in Europe, it was a white education. And then I came back for a PhD at, master's at Columbia and a PhD at Columbia. So that's the best that they give their own. And in that education, the history of Europe was built around wars, of Europeans fighting others. Even when you learn the American history, it's the French and Indian War. It's the American Revolution. It's the French Revolution. It's the Haitian Revolution. So there's a whole series of wars. And when you learn English history, it's the 100 Years' War between England and France. The first 100 Years' War, 1400s, that's the period of Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc is a hero because she was fighting the English. And that's the first 100 Years' War. 100 years, England fighting France. And then in the 1700s, it's the second 100 Years' War. All these wars that we learn about, the War of the Spanish Succession, the War of French and Indian War, the American Revolutionary War, the Napoleonic Wars, all those are the second 100 Years' War. England and France fighting each other for 100 years, taking a break in between for a year or two, and then starting up another war. But you're correct in mentioning that we don't see where Africa is in these war situations. And that's where they do keep us in the, in the dark. Because the fight by many of these European nations was around control over the slave system. And so that's part of the work that I've been working on for years. And what I do is establish 1482 to 1536 as the 50-year turning point of history. Before that time, Europe was land poor, resource poor, people poor. But after 1482, Europe began to move out of its icebox and try to get around the Islamic world that controlled the Mediterranean to get over to Asia. And so the Portuguese start sailing down the coast of Africa. They're afraid to go way out into the sea, into the ocean, because they may fall off. So they stay near the coast, and they discover Morocco, and then they discover Senegal, then discover the Gambia, then discover Sierra Leone, then they go down the coast here to Ghana, then they go down to Dahomey, then to Nigeria, all the way down to Angola in the 1440s. And then they come back here in the 1482, because this was the best base with this rock called Elmina, and with the river and the bay. It was a relatively protected harbor, so they saw that as the place where they could establish their base and continue their explorations and continue to slave their trading of enslaved Africans and gold. And then Columbus, who they say was here in 1482, found out about traveling west over the ocean and going east and getting to the east. And so he came up with the idea of going east. And so he tried to float it in Spain and other places, and it didn't float. But then in 1492, January, Grenada fell, the last Muslim stronghold, Moorish stronghold. And that meant that the Catholics were victorious in their war against the Moors after hundreds of years. But it also meant that the Catholics, now in power, with the help of Jews who switched from the Islam Moors to the Catholics, now the Catholics decided they were going to victimize the Jews. So by March they declared that all Jews who had converted to Christianity and were backsliding had to leave Spain. And they gave them a certain period to get their act together to become true Christians, otherwise they had to leave. Then they decided that the Jews who were allowed to be Jews in Spain that had not converted were too much of a temptation for the Jews that had converted, so they said, we think you guys better get out too. So here the Jewish community that's well established in Spain and Portugal now had to leave. Now here comes Columbus with his idea about sailing west. And so nobody would buy it. But these Jews, knowing that they're being pushed out of Spain, said, wait a minute, let's look at it. Because if there's something on the other side, maybe that's where we can go when we're kicked out. So the converted Jews of Spain funded Columbus. So we learn a little myth that Columbus's voyage was funded by Queen Isabella's jewels, when in point of fact, Columbus's voyage was funded by Queen Isabella's Jews. And their names are historically recorded: Sant'Angelo and Abernal. They were the treasurers for the money people around the throne of Ferdinand and Isabel. And these were the people that Columbus signed his contract with. So by August, these people had to get out of Spain. And that's when Columbus set sail. And he did take some converted Jews with him, but he was financed by them. And when he sighted land and he reported back to Spain, he reported back to them. In fact, Columbus kept two journals, one for the Spanish throne and one which was the real deal, which was the Jewish financiers that financed him. So the history has not been told, but it's there. So from the very beginning, because Columbus is the first enslaver, the Jewish community of wealth was involved with the enslavement process, in Spain and Portugal, and then they continued in the Protestant nations of the Dutch and the English. And so their involvement spans the whole spectrum of enslavement. So if you want to see a thread that links things together, it's good to follow the rich Jewish involvement in the slave system, and then you can see all the parameters. Now, luckily, this book by Hugh Thomas, in which he says only 2 Jews were involved, that he could find, were involved in the slave trade. When I read it, with the Jeffries analysis, and the Jeffries eyes, and the Jeffries intelligence, and his budding brilliance, I said this book is a blessing. I have never seen anything with such a wealth of information on the Jewish involvement in enslavement in the New World. But it's not referred to as the Jewish involvement. Okay. It's the Morenos, M-A-R-R-O-N-A-N-O-N-S. In other words, the converted Jews.
Those Jews who had converted
Catholicism, and then went to Mexico, went to Peru, went to Argentina, went to New Granada, which is Colombia and Venezuela. And he cites all of them. And you can see the enormity of their involvement like I never saw before. So when I read that, I said, whoops, there it is, another piece of the puzzle. In fact, I don't go to bed at night until I find another piece of the puzzle. And then I can just fall asleep like a baby after I say, whoops, there it is, go on to sleep.
A similar story is spoken about John Hawkins and Queen Elizabeth I, where she didn't have money to fund the voyage of John Hawkins, and she went to her moneylenders. Who was her moneylenders? Who were her moneylenders?
Well, during the Queen Elizabeth period, you're talking about in the 1560s, when Elizabeth I, the Tudor queen, whose father was Henry VIII, famous for womanizing and murdering women and establishing the Anglican Church in the 1530s. Queen Elizabeth would have been the first slaving queen of England by funding and helping to fund Hawkins, Drake, and Raleigh, who later became Sir Walter Raleigh, Sir Francis Drake, and John Hawkins. And their attempt to raid the Spanish fleet and Spanish colonies was funded by a series of funders, some of whom were from Jewish sources, others would have been from Huguenot French sources, the Protestants of France. They were very strong financially in this period of time. But the real financing of English endeavors in enslavement might have gotten started with the Jewish community with Queen Elizabeth, but they become systematized and become part of the real system of exploitation in the 1600s. And that was something I dealt with this afternoon, because I was trying to show that the Portuguese were given by the Pope Africa and Brazil and the Indian Ocean in the papal decree of 1493. And Spain was given North America, Central America, most of South America, and the Pacific. And so that meant Portugal had the sources of enslaved Africans. And so we've got to be able to see that. So when I said the 50-year turning point of history, and I usually name the dates, 1482, Elmina is established by the Portuguese, 1492, Grenada Falls, the Jewish Inquisition in Spain, and then in 1492 also Columbus' so-called discovery of the New World. So when the 1482 activity occurs, the Portuguese build this monster fort dungeon called Elmina for serious trading with Africa. So we can refer to that ism as mercantilism, trading. But then when Columbus discovers the New World, then these lands are discovered. And so they start planting flags and they establish colonies. So you get colonialism emerging. And then by the time Spain and Portugal are competing with each other, finding new lands and planting flags and developing these colonies, the Pope has to be called in to decide who gets what. And it's really ironic that these insignificant little Catholic nations are running around the world, planting flags, claiming people's land, and then the Pope gets in and blesses it and divides up the world. In 1493-94, gives half of it to Spain and half of it to Portugal. The Papal Bulls of 1493 and the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. And that division of the world we're still dealing with today. Mozambique, Angola, and Guinea-Bissau in 1974 were still fighting against Portuguese control of their lands, which was given to them by the Catholic Church 500 years before. So we need to see those important dates. 1490s also, Columbus comes back again. He brings sugarcane this time. And that becomes the death and destruction of the New World, because you need plantationism. So when the Pope gets in the picture, you get imperialism, because you link these colonies together into a special system. The plantation starts the need for labor. Native Americans are worked, and they begin to die out, so you get genocidism of the Native Americans. A Catholic Bishop, Bartolome de las Casas, he wasn't a bishop then, he was a priest, he decides to save the Native Americans. He writes a book called History of the Indies. To save the Native Americans, he asked the Spanish throne and the Pope in Rome to bring over Africans who have no souls to save the Native American souls for the Catholic Church. So actually, he helps to initiate this process of the destruction of Africans. At the same time, he's writing a book about the destruction of the Native Americans. So you get this dual relationship from Bartolome de las Casas. And in the early 1500s, they start to bring over systematically Africans under what was called the asiento. 1516 or thereabouts, they bring over a certain number of Africans every year to work the plantations. And that asiento was a contract which was eventually fought over by European nations, because it became so significant and wealthy that wars were fought by European nations for control of the asiento. And whoever got control of the asiento, that signaled their rise to prominence in this economic system of exploiting economics, politics, and culture. 1517, an important date in the 50-year turning point of history, because that's when the Protestant Reformation is dated as beginning around Luther. And this is important because Luther attacks the Catholic Church for corruption. Catholic Church was selling places in heaven called indulgences. And Luther thought that this was ungodly. So he says we don't need a relationship between priests and bishops and archbishops and a pope. We can go directly to God. And so that becomes the core of Protestantism, removing the Catholic intermediaries in between the individual and God. But what that unleashes on the world needs to be understood, because the concept of the elect of God, certain people elected by God to rule over others, comes out of that, because the concept developed that if I'm beating you up, stealing your land, raping your women, God has given me the right to do that. I'm the elect of God, and I'm the chosen. And so this whole concept that we have today of the wealthy people feeling they can run over the world, control it, exploit it, destroy it, is the concept, the Ronald Reaganism of the concept of the elect of God that's built into the wealthy. But this concept of the elect of God, showing that the Catholic Church controlled the actions of people, needs to be understood, because it refers to the question that Abdul mentioned. When the Catholic Church controlled life in Europe from the fall of the Roman Empire and then the beginning of the Holy Roman Empire up until the so-called Middle Ages, the Catholic Church had a lot of myths and misconceptions about it. And one of them was that if you managed money and you made interest on the money, then you couldn't get into purgatory. And purgatory is the step between heaven and earth. And so with the Catholic Church, you have to go to purgatory first, and then you can buy your way into heaven later. And so if you dealt with money, and made money on money, interest, it's usury, and you go to the devil. So that left the whole area of managing money over to people who were not Catholics, and they happened to be Jews. And the Catholic Church also said that law only comes from the holy word of the Pope or his Council of Cardinals. So canon law was respected by the church. But as the economy began to move in Europe and link up, there was a whole nother commercial law and contracts that was being devised. And the Pope said that that was ungodly and you wouldn't get into heaven if you dealt with that. So that left the whole area of economic contracts and whatnot, and law left open to the Jewish community. And then the popes also said that to heal yourself involved burning candles and fingering rosary beads. So they didn't believe in medicine or any scientific approach to medicine. So that left the whole field of medicine open to the Jewish community. So the leading members of the Jewish community were involved in the management of finances, the laws that control the movement of economics and politics, and the health of the rich people who needed physicians. So around the emperors and the princes and whatnot were these people who in Spain were called the grandees. In Eastern Europe they were called the court Jews. And so these were people who managed the wealth and the power, Jewish people who managed it for Europeans. So that's a part of the mix. That Jews, rich Jews, were in strategic positions because of the way the Catholic Church had prevented them from owning property, prevented them from getting into certain fields. So the Jews had to invent a new type of money because they were constantly being victimized by people who didn't like Jews. Because in the history of the Middle Ages, the Jews would run out of every European country. And many cities had laws that they could not come in those cities. Cities like Vienna and Frankfurt and whatnot. These were free cities who could make their own rules, and they kept the Jews out because they didn't want them competing as merchants. And so many princes wanted to control, or emperors wanted to control these free cities. And in order to control them, they used the Jewish commercial and money people to try to mess with these free cities. So they would allow them to set up trading towns around the free cities. So there's a conflict between the free cities like Copenhagen and Hamburg and Frankfurt and Vienna and the Jewish community, and the emperors and the princes were allowing them to fund them in order to fight the city. So there's a whole other struggle in Europe that's not known unless you know European history. So to be very frank, we can't understand the enslavement system unless we have mastered European history. And most of us say, well, I don't want to deal with no European history. I'm African-centered. Well, you ain't really African-centered if you can't put Europe in the equation. I don't want to do nothing. I'm dealing with Africa. I want to deal with Americas. Well, if you can't put the Native Americans and what happened to them in the equation, you can't understand why the Africans were at the center of things. So I don't want to deal with no Arabs. I'm going to deal with African-centeredness. Well, if you don't deal with Arabs and Islam, then you can't understand what the relationship of Islam and the Moors and Europe was, and the relationship of the Mediterranean, why the Europeans were trying to get around the Mediterranean in order to get to Asia because of the control of the Mediterranean by people who are Islamic. So if you don't have a world perspective, then you can't even understand your African center. And so that, fortunately, is what we've been able to do. But this 50-year turning point of history, 1482 to 1536, culminated with the Protestant Reformation with the in 1517, with the Asiento in 1516, and then 1519, Cortez conquers the Aztecs, new wealth for Spain. 1531-32, Pizarro conquers the Incas in the high Andes, new wealth for Spain. And 1532, the Protestant Reformation takes a new turn. It becomes a theocratics developed by Calvin, who links economics, politics, and culture. With the Catholic Church, you separated politics, and economics, and culture and the church. With the Protestants, they linked economics, politics, and culture into a system capability of the new state formulation. And so Calvinism of 1532 is a continuation of Lutheranism of 1517, and then Henry VIII, because of his itchy penis, gets into the act in the 1530s, and he wanted to marry and get rid of his wife, and the Pope had said he's not going to allow him to do that, and if he separated from his wife or divorced his wife, he would be excommunicated. So the wife conveniently died, so the Pope excommunicated Henry VIII, and then he married Anne Boleyn, and then the Pope said, "You're out of the Catholic Church." So he said, "Oh, that's cool. I'll set up my own Catholic Church." So he set up the Anglican Church. So we really have to understand the great Church of England, the Anglican Church, when America becomes the Episcopalian High Church, really does not come out of a religious conversion. It comes out of the itchy penis of Henry VIII. And that's kind of raw, but we need to put it out there as the real deal. So here now you have the new nation building. Henry VIII establishes a new nation, taking the Protestant model from Geneva with Calvin. Now Calvin's Geneva was a small enclave in Europe. It didn't have the system capabilities to be a powerful nation. But England is an island with a landmass and protected by an island. So England has a possibility of becoming a nation state of significance, and it becomes the prototype of the first European nation state, dealing with economics, politics, and culture, not as separated, but as unified. And then competing with England is a merchant state that didn't make any pretense about having anything else but commerce going, and that was the United Provinces, which becomes the Netherlands, which becomes Holland as one of the United Provinces with Zeeland and the others. So in the 1600s, you get this competition between the new Protestant English and the new Protestant Dutch. But even though they're competing with each other, their real enemy are the Catholics Portuguese, and the Catholics Spanish. And so the Dutch and the English have an alliance to rip off the system from the Spanish. In the 1500s and the Portuguese, it was established the system of our oppression. I call it the European world system of domination, was established in the 1500s, controlled by the Catholic nations, blessed by the Pope. But Protestantism emerges in the 1500s, and they began to first to pirate the Spanish system, like Queen Elizabeth helped fund, and then to raid it with fleets like the Dutch did at the end of the 1500s, and trying to take Brazil and trying to take Africa. And then they decide to unify, and the Dutch and the English began to unify their attacks. And so in the 1600s, you see the Dutch and the English taking over the system from the Catholics. But after they do that, in the early 1600s, then they start to fight each other, because the Dutch passed an economic law, the Navigation Acts, or the English, to protect from the Dutch trade, because they couldn't compete with the Dutch. So the English passed a law, 1651, to keep the products of Holland out of England, to control English economic development. So that, since Holland was an economic nation, that was a declaration of war. So by 1652, the first Anglo-Dutch war, the war between the Dutch and the English, has taken place over these economics. And the big economic pie, though, is in the Caribbean, because sugar is now moving in the Caribbean. It's moved in by Dutch Jews, because in the 1650s, they lost Brazil. They took Brazil in the 1630s, and they worked Brazil as the sugar plum of the European world, and a lot of money was made on sugar. But the Portuguese were trying to get their act together, because there was a united kingdom of Spain and Portugal, And Spain was taking care of Spanish business and not taking care of Portuguese business. So at a moment when the Spanish throne was weak and financially in difficulty, Portugal broke from Spain and set up a independent Portuguese nation. But in order for them to remain independent, they had no money. So you can't remain independent if you don't have any money. So, right. So they had to go to the Jews of Spain and and the Spanish territories outside of Spain, like Antwerp, Belgium, to get money to finance their war against Spain. And since the Jews owed no allegiance to Spain because they were always being messed over by the Spanish, they were willing to help fund the war, the separation of Portugal from Spain, hoping that they would be able to use their relationship with Portugal to further the trade with Africa. And that actually happened. But the ironic thing is that the Portuguese got their military act together, so they threw the Dutch out of Brazil. But sugar became so important an item that you would have thought that that's the end of the Jewish establishment in the New World, because Recife, Brazil, becomes the first free Jewish nation, first free Jewish settlement, first free Jewish colony in the New World, where you can actually have a synagogue. They actually had a synagogue in Recife. So they could take the cover off of being converted and function as Jews. So this is an important point, because one of the criticisms of myself and others is that you say that the Jews were involved in slavery because they were Jews, but the few that were involved in slavery were just merchants. When in point of fact, that might seem to be the case, but when you look deeper and analyze it, the Jewish involvement in slavery was tied in because they were Jews. Their involvement in slavery meant that they could negotiate a freer Jewish community in the European nations. And if they offered to help with slavery, they could negotiate a contract to have a free community and to have privileges and restrictions removed. And that's what they did. And the beautiful thing is, it's all in documents. It's all written. There's no oral tradition. There's no storytelling. It's written documents there for the world to see.
In their own words.
In their own words, in their own language. And that's how the 13 colonies emerge. The first major colony is Brazil, but they lose that in 1654. But they started losing it in the 1640s. They finally lost it in 1654 when the 14 ships had to leave, and then as a result of that, the Jewish community that went from Brazil to Amsterdam was sent out to colonize the Caribbean. And what were the colonies? Among the first colonies outside of Brazil was Curacao. So there are 3 Jewish colonial schemes for Curacao. One in 1651, one in 1652, another in 1659. The one in 1651 and 1652 didn't work because they were attempting to establish agricultural settlements to work sugar. But Curacao is not a land-based island. Curacao is a sandbar off of the coast of northern South America. So you can't grow anything in sand. So that didn't work. So they began to smuggle things into the slave system of the Spanish. And so when they came back in 1659, they came back to do business. And from that point on, Curacao becomes the Amsterdam of the Caribbean as the leading center for enslavement and trading slave products. At the height of Curacao, let's say about 1700, half of Curaçao's population was Jewish. And half of the 4,000 Jews in the Caribbean were in the little island of Curacao. So you see how important it became. But the real wealth for sugar comes not from Curacao, but come from the 3 colonies in Suriname. And so those three colonies became Barbados, Demerara, and Essequibo. I can't pronounce it properly, but that's the name. It sounds a little something like that. Those were three colonies, sugar colonies, that were planted in northern South America, where we call Suriname and Guyana. And one was planted in the French Guyane, which is French Guyana, at Remire, R-E-M-I-R-E. And I was so glad last year when I went to UNESCO and I spoke at a conference on slavery, and I spoke in French. They asked me, I was just glad to get there, but then they asked me to come up and speak, and then they asked me, did I want to speak in English or French? I looked at most of the people that looked like they were French, so I said, I'll speak in French. So I got to the mic and I started out, Mesdames et messieurs, mes frères, mes sœurs, je suis très content de venir ici à Paris pour présenter à la conférence sur l'esclavage. So I just blew the roof off the place, talking about reparations, systems analysis, and everything else. So after that, the people came to me and asked me, would I go 3 weeks from then to South America, to Guyane, and to Guadeloupe and Martinique to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the French end of slavery. So I said yes. And so before I knew it, after May, in June, I'm in South America. And as soon as I hit the airport and we were going into town, I see a sign that says Remire, and I said, whoops, there it is. One of the Jewish colonies, slaving colonies. And so there were 3 in Suriname, 3 in Curacao, 1 in Tobago, 1 in Martinique and Guadeloupe, and several of the islands off of Aruba, and another little island, Saint Eustatius. So these were, most people don't realize that these sugar islands in the Caribbean were heavily influenced by the Jewish community because sugar was a technical specialty. Sugar is not just planting. Sugar is an industrial enterprise. Sugar involves certain secrets of how you process material. Sugar is highly intensive. You have to have you have to have the mill, and you have to have the water power, and you have to have the oxen, and you have to have a heavy manpower for the cane, and you have to have the export and whatnot. And so capital intensive and high technology was in the hands of the Dutch and the Jews. And so they controlled sugar in the Caribbean. And the first sugar island in the Caribbean is the little island of Barbados. And the Jewish community from Brazil helped to transform Barbados in a period of 10 years. The British established Barbados. The Portuguese founded Barbados in the 1500s. But there was nothing there for them to worry about, so they preferred to have the mainland of Spain, of New Spain, Mexico, Peru, where you had gold mines and diamond and silver mines and all that business. So they just left Barbados. So it's rediscovered by the British in 1625 or 1627. And the British establish it with poor British farmers. Eventually 11,000 tobacco farmers are established in Barbados with small plots. But tobacco is not making money. This is the 1630s. Tobacco is not making money in Virginia and the North American colonies. So the savior is brought in, and that's sugar. And the Jewish community from Brazil brings in sugar. So within 10 years, from the 1630s to the 1640s, Barbados moves from 11,000 small proprietors to 900 sugar estates. And from that point on, Barbados becomes the jewel of the British Caribbean. And from the 1640s, 50s, and 60s, more wealth is produced in that little island of Barbados than all of the 13 colonies in North America.
Now, you said it went from 11,000.
11,000 small farmers trying to grow tobacco and not making economic headway to being consolidated into 900 sugar estates.
Okay, now I understand the relationship.
Okay. Now, what you also want to understand is how Jewish law, how British anti-Jewish law affects the Jewish involvement in slavery. The English were anti-Jewish, so they had regulations that the Jews could not hire indentured servants.
In other words, they couldn't hire white.
They couldn't hire white folks. So in order for the Jews to have labor in their businesses or their plantations, they had to have enslaved Africans. So once the 11,000 small proprietorships were failing and they were consolidating, those people who had lost their land or were bought out, these poor white farmers, could not become indentures on the sugar plantation. So many of these white farmers left Barbados and went to South Carolina to try to start up slaving there. And many of them went to a wild pirate island inhabited by pirates and whores called Jamaica. And so they went to Jamaica. That was not desired by anybody because the terrain was so wild and the people were so inhospitable, meaning they were pirates and brigands and whatnot. And so many of these poor white people had nowhere to go. So they went to Jamaica and joined the whoring and the pirating.
In your element.
They were in their element. But Barbados was prospering and becoming the jewel. But ironically, when the Dutch got kicked out of Brazil, a Jewish rabbi, Menashe ben Israel, was planning to go with 500 of his people to head the synagogue in Recife. But before he could do that, and his brother was already there, before he could do that, the synagogue left Brazil and came to Amsterdam because they had to evacuate. So the next year, 1655, Menashe ben Israel writes a famous letter to Cromwell. And it's in all the Jewish history books. But there's no context for the letter. And he's asking Cromwell to allow the Jews to come back into England after being kicked out for several hundred years. And Cromwell wants them to come back because he's the new leader of England. His power hasn't been fully consolidated, and he needs as much help as he can get. In the revolution, the Cromwellian revolution, they cut off the head of the king, etc., etc. And so this new force is controlling the English nation. Menashe ben Israel says, if you let us back into England, we can help you like we helped the Dutch. And right now you have this competition between the English and the Dutch. The English just passed the Navigation Acts to keep Dutch products out because they can't compete with the Dutch. So now you have a Jew from Amsterdam saying, we can help you financially like we did with the Dutch. So Cromwell wants to help. But the rich English people who don't want this competition say no. So the rich English people who control Parliament block a law from being passed to allow the Jews to come back. But Cromwell gets around that, just like Clinton works around the U.S. Congress, by saying, we don't need a law. You can come because there's no law keeping you out. No. English law is not written. Okay. So much of it is common law, so much of it is activity, so much of it is just habit, what people do, custom. And so he said, the custom has never been followed to keep you out. So come on in. But the agreement was only the wealthy can come in. And so, because we don't want the others getting afraid that you're going to move into the crafts and the guilds will be threatened, etc., there'll be a groundswell of opposition. So he fought off the rich by having the Jews help him establish either the Bank of England or the English Exchange. And in that, there are 100 Anglican directors on the board, 12 non-Anglican directors on the board, and 12 Jewish directors on the board. So within a few years of not being in England, the Jews now are in the center of the economic enterprise that's going to help to build the English economy. But here's the story of Cromwell. 1655, Cromwell, not even having control of the English nation, decides to have his grand design to take the Spanish Empire. My contention is that he couldn't even think of taking the Spanish Empire, funding a fleet to go to the New World, unless he had a source of wealth that had a history of funding these operations. And the only people who had a history of funding these operations, including the military operations, were the Jewish community. Because they could put the money package together, taking wealth from the different areas of Europe where the Jews are, and coming up with a quick money package. So with the Jewish money behind him, Cromwell came up with the grand design of taking the Spanish Empire, and the first base was to take Cuba. So the fleet was sent out to take Cuba, but they got their butts kicked. So the story about Menashe ben Israel and Cromwell is very significant, and it needs to be woven into the historical context of the systems analysis. And after the English fleet got its butt kicked off of Cuba, Cromwell told them not to come home without a prize. And the potential prize is this island of ruffians, pirates, and harlots called Jamaica. So the fleet was sent from its defeat in Cuba to take Jamaica. And it was easy to take because there was nobody there to defend it. Nobody wanted it, so he was able to take Jamaica. And so he could claim a victory. That was fortuitous for the English, even though Cromwell was not there to enjoy the benefits of it, because Cromwell was overthrown and there was a restoration of the crown, and James II took over after marrying into the Portuguese slaving family of the Braganzas. And the queen from Portugal married into the English throne, and so you linked Portugal's slaving operation with the English, with a claim on it now through marriage. This becomes very significant because the English now are fighting the Dutch for control over the slave system, and they now have claim on it through the throne of Queen Braganza. Now, Queens in New York is named after her. And so recently, a couple years ago, they tried to put up a statue. Some people from Portugal wanted to put up a statue almost as large as the Statue of Liberty to Queen Braganza. And some of our people were awake to it, so they blocked it. And then when we helped them with the research on who that was and what that was all about, it was prevented from happening. But the point that I needed to make was that Barbados now becomes the sugar jewel. And I don't call it one of the Jewish colonies, but I'm going to look into it to see. It definitely was one of the Jewish-inspired sugar colonies. It may not have a significant personnel base because the English restricted the Jews from controlling land. But they brought the technology that transformed Barbados and made it relatively wealthy compared to the other American colonies. 1660, you have another Anglo-Dutch War, 1665. The English win this war. So New Amsterdam, which was established in 1623, when the Dutch were expanding the system of enslavement. And they did it by establishing in 1621 the Dutch West Indian Company. The Spanish were trying to prevent them from establishing the company, but they went ahead and established it anyway. And that was almost a declaration of war against Spain. Well, they were at war with Spain anyway. The Dutch broke from the Spanish in 1580 and waged an 80-year war for independence. And their independence was not recognized until the 1660s. So you have to see an 80-year war of the Dutch against the Spanish in order to even understand their relationship. And since the Kingdom of Spain and Portugal was either joining or separating or joining or separating, the war was against the Catholic nations, Spain and Portugal. So unless you can see that Spain and Portugal relationship, the Dutch and the English relationship, the relationship between Portugal and the Dutch, you can't even understand what enslavement was all about. So I kind of resent when people say they're going to study the slave routes of how somebody brought somebody down from northern Ghana and left them here. That's not their system. You know, you have to see this whole other thing going on. But Barbados has worked so hard and exhausted its soil after 30 or 40 years that the English need a new sugar island. So in 1665, New Amsterdam, which was just established in 1623, and then they brought Africans in 1626. New Amsterdam is given to the Dutch, and it's named after the Duke of York, who eventually becomes the King of England. And so it becomes New York. And then the English give the Dutch Suriname, full control of Suriname. So Suriname now consolidates the three Jewish colonies into one grand colony. And they are located on what is called the Jordan Savannah, the Jewish Savannah. It's like a separate Jewish nation with 115, eventually 115 slave plantations with tens of thousands of Africans. They're separate military and everything. And they become infamous in African history because not only were they enslaving Africans, but they put a military in place to go to war against the Bush Negro republics of escaped Africans who went into the bush and established independence. There's a whole history of the Jewish militias fighting against these African peoples. But an interesting episode in 1667 occurred when a group of Jews wanted to leave the Dutch control, Suriname, and go to Jamaica. 13 Jewish families with hundreds of Africans enslaved were asking permission to leave, and the Dutch governor of Suriname said, no, you're too valuable, I can't afford to leave you, let you leave. So there's a historical struggle from 1667 to 1676, 10 years, of these people fighting to get out of Suriname and to go to Jamaica. And eventually they do. And when they do, from the 1670s on, Jamaica kicks in as a replacement for Barbados as the sugar island. By 1703, because of marriage, France has the Asiento. By 1713, after war between France and England over the Spanish throne, the War of the Spanish Succession, England gets the Asiento, and that signals, that's the Treaty of Utrecht, and that signals the English control, beginning control and domination over the slave trade. So in the 1700s, the English dominated the slave trade. In the 1800s, the Dutch took it and dominated it. And the English fought 4 wars to get it from the Dutch, and eventually they're successful. At the end of the 1600s, the Dutch are so successful that they even control the Asiento, which is most unusual. And at a period of time, the Jews controlled it through the Dutch. And also in that period of time, the 1660s, Jewish money from Spain and Portugal left wholesale and came to Amsterdam. Whole families with fortunes left and went to Amsterdam and Hamburg. And so you see the Jewish money drain. And what they did was they created for almost 100 years the golden age of the Dutch. And that becomes their golden age.
During the period where they had their period of cultural enlightenment.
Right. In fact,
the artists.
The artists, the great works of the great artists in Amsterdam. Van Gogh, and all the rest of them. And the great portraits that they produced. In fact, Rembrandt produced a portrait of a Jewish patriarch, one of his famous paintings. And so this was the period of great wealth. But what was that wealth based upon? It was mainly based upon the slave and system that the Dutch and the Jewish partners were able to get control of. So you can see why they want to hide the history, because we consider the Dutch very decent people who grow tulips and wear wood shoes and push windmills, and when they turned out to be the most vicious enslavers of them all. And the link with the English needs to be understood, as well as the link with the Spanish. I had mentioned before that Queen Elizabeth may have had some serious Jewish funding, or Huguenot Dutch, or Huguenot, French Huguenot Protestant funding. But in the 1660s, there was serious Dutch Jewish funding of the English throne. Cromwell first, and that helped him with his grand design, 1655. And then there was a conflict in the English throne. The House of Orange in Holland married into the English throne. And so William of Orange was helping his wife claim the English throne. And so William III invaded England in 1688. The funding for William III's expedition was largely from the Jewish community. So from that point on, the Jewish community is in England through the highest level, the king himself. And so unless you can see these things and understand these things, you really can't make an analysis of what the system of enslavement was all about. But for me, it's a fantastic story.
Yes, indeed.
And but we're going to have difficulty when we raise the 13 Jewish sugar colonies. The last one, I count the sugar colonies from 1630 in Brazil to 1733 in America. So I'm not even sure whether I want to include the American colony, but I just may, just to give myself continuity. That American colony was Savannah, Georgia. Georgia was established in the 1730s as a non-slave colony. A colony that would be a buffer between Spanish Florida and the English colonies, and to prevent enslaved peoples from running off and joining the Native Americans, the Seminoles and whatnot, and escaping to Spanish Florida. So they wanted a free colony, and that was a humanitarian, Oglethorpe, who conceived of the idea, and they took white people, non-Jewish people, to Georgia to settle. And they did. And lo and behold, here comes a group of 44 or more Jews who were not invited. They didn't go through Oglethorpe's system. They made a special arrangement through the Bank of England or whatever. But here they arrive in Savannah. And the people don't want them. But the white folks, after trying to make it, it becomes clear to them that they can't make it without Africans. So even though they came to a so-called non-slave experiment, they start petitioning to bring in enslaved Africans. And the Jews want to join the petition, and they tell the Jews, we don't want you to join our petition. So they put their own petition in. So when the colonies were not given their petition for enslavement, many of the Jews who came to Savannah to enslave Africans and be a part of the slave system left and went to Charleston where there was an establishment enslavement, and they helped develop Charleston as the largest Jewish community in America. But even in the pre-war size, Charleston's Jewish community was only about 500. That doesn't compare with Curacao that had 2,000, or Recife that had 1,500, or Suriname, which had a couple thousand. So you can see the comparative size. It's in the Caribbean that the real Jewish community is. But we don't want to put the enslavement process on any one group. We want to lay it out on the foot of all these Europeans, because we want to raise the question of reparations. We don't want to hide the involvement of Africans, because we have to appeal to the Africans for repatriation, and that's an in-house family thing. We're not interested in reparations for Africans on the continent, but we do want repatriation. But all of the European nations owe Africans reparation, and we need to put that in documents and present it before the world, because the history of enslavement clearly documents the destruction of African peoples and the war against Africans and the crime against humanity that slavery was all about.